Dans l'année 1762,
in the year 1762, Monsieur Dabadie, the Director General.
First of all, we have to say that very few cities in the world have an original account from an eyewitness that says exactly why and how, where and when their city was founded.
Cette compagnie se forma sous la raison de Pierre Laclède Liguest.
It's a remarkable circumstance that something like this survived. There's a lot of mystique about this document. It's controversial.
It is called Chouteau's journal or narrative, Auguste Chouteau's account of the events of 1763 and 64. Every history, every portrayal and reenactment has drawn on Chouteau's memories of the founding of St. Louis. But historians have looked much deeper into colonial records, maps, letters, and journals to fill in the blanks, to clarify, correct, and even to challenge this document.
If Auguste Chouteau can give us one version, why can't we have another?
Où il disait avec un espèce d'enthousiasme.
But historians do agree that there is a story here we don't know well enough about a time and a place in American history quite unlike any other. And he was there.
Davantage pour sa localité et son point central pour faire des établissements. Il s'occupa le restant de l'hiver à se procurer tous les objets nécessaires pour cet établissement.
This program is made possible by support from the St. Louis Mercantile Library at the University of Missouri St. Louis and from viewers like you.
Feature of the memorial is the Gateway Arch, and the arch is a monument which commemorates the time when St. Louis was the gateway to the West.
St. Louis loves its historic role in United States history. The Louisiana Purchase, Lewis and Clark, gateway to the West. The monument to that era would be built where St. Louis began, and the romantic and sometimes violent tale of settlement and conquest would overshadow a very different kind of story that had happened here before.
When a multicultural group of people lived in harmony with native people and created this commercial enterprise that was international in scope.
And that is how Auguste Chouteau, or Chouteau as we now often say, began his journal, with the French commandant in New Orleans granting partners Antoine Maxent and Pierre Laclede
exclusive trade with the Indians of the Missouri and all nations residing west of the Mississippi.
Maxent would run things in New Orleans, and Laclede, or more properly Laclede, would set up the trading post and deal with the local Indians. Laclede left New Orleans with supplies and with his 13-year-old clerk and stepson, Auguste Chouteau. This was long before the steamboat age, and the grueling trip rowing loaded boats against the current took 3 months. When Laclede was heading up from New Orleans, he wasn't coming into unexplored territory. This was an area already dotted with French forts and farms and settlements and Indian villages. There was a lot of economic, political, and military activity. He was just looking for a place to set up business. This was the heart of what was known on both sides of the river as the Illinois country. Cahokia had been settled in 1699. There was Kaskaskia, St. Genevieve, Prairie du Rocher, a farming village near Fort de Chartres, the capital of the Illinois country. The fort is now a rebuilt historic site and a place where reenactors gather for their annual rendezvous. The colonial population in the Illinois country wasn't all that big, and there were slaves, Africans, and Indians. There was lead mining and farming. The meat and flour of this region was helping to feed New Orleans.
Bonjour, comme ça va?
And then there was the competitive, risky, and potentially highly profitable fur trade. And Laclede, here portrayed by Doug Harding, was the new guy in this world when he unloaded and stored his goods at the fort.
There was an established culture, an established social and legal culture. To start St. Louis history with Pierre Laclede overlooks the history of the Illinois country.
But Laclede arrived at a turning point in that history. Under a treaty that ended the French and Indian, or 7 Years' War, The British would soon be taking over the land east of the Mississippi, including the fort. France was also giving away the western portion of the Illinois country to Spain, but that was still secret. As far as everybody knew, the future for a Frenchman was on the other side of the Mississippi, and that's where Laclede was heading.
So as soon as I get everything loaded in here, I plan to scout up the Mississippi River as far as the Missouri and see if I can find a location.
He set out from Fort de Château in the month of December, taking with him a trusted young man.
He means himself, but Chouteau at this point is writing in the third person.
And he inspected all the land from Fort de Château to the Missouri country.
At the confluence of the two great rivers, they could see the obvious problem. This, as we know, is land that floods. Good for farming, but bad for business. And Laclede was all about business.
So they allow the river current to bring them back down the river. And they get back down to a site with this wonderful, inviting bluff. And they think, oh, put the town at the top of that bluff. We don't have to worry about floods. It's a great commanding position.
There was a 40-foot limestone bluff.
It may have been as cold in December of 1763 as it was 250 years later, when today's Pierre Laclede, a boy dressed as young Auguste Chouteau, and other volunteers gathered in the Arch parking garage to reenact the historic event at the very spot it took place. The plan to travel a few hundred yards by canoe was decided to be ill-advised and dangerous, so they walked along the levee. But what happened pretty much followed Auguste Chouteau's script.
Laclede was delighted to see the location where St. Louis is now. He did not hesitate a moment to make the settlement where he envisioned. After thoroughly inspecting everything, he decided on the place where he wished to make his settlement, notched some trees with his own hand, and said,
"Remember this place, Auguste. In the spring, when the ice breaks from the river, you will return to this place, and you will be in charge of building the buildings for the fur trade posts. And I want you to build my trading post right here. Do you understand?"
Keep in mind that Chouteau wrote his journal 40 years or more after these events. By then, Laclede was dead, and the 14-year-old assistant had become St. Louis's leading citizen. He had power and money, an impressively elegant signature, and a big house with plenty of visitors who no doubt asked him many times how all of this got started.
He's called a great raconteur. He was the founding father. And so all of the generals and foreign dignitaries who came to St. Louis would consult with or talk to Chouteau. And the journal certainly has the feel of a many times told tale.
And we do not have the whole story. Chouteau's journal is just 14 pages, 7 pieces of paper written on both sides. And clearly, it is a rough draft.
I think the story about this was that somehow or other a longer draft, or maybe a complete book, was burned in a fire.
Chouteau's son Gabriel found these surviving pages, and they were donated to the Mercantile Library in 1858.
We care for it, we conserve it. It's in a climate-controlled vault.
This is not merely a priceless document, it's actually a pretty good read.
Nous partîmes de suite pour nous rendre au fort de Chartres, où il disait avec un espèce d'enthousiasme à monsieur...
The words are Auguste Chouteau's, but the voice is that of Webster University language professor Lionel Cuillé.
Devenir une des plus belles villes de l'Amérique. It is clearly an 18th century style. It feels, it has the authenticity of a diary. It is not a polished text, but it's what makes the beauty of this document, is that it really brings us closer to the moment of the founding. It sounds like a draft, indeed. Vivre, outils, etc. Chouteau, at times, describes himself as a character because he talks about himself in the third-person narrative. So he would say, and then Laclede asked Chouteau to clear the land.
People have wondered if Chouteau wasn't embellishing things a bit, building up his own importance in the founding of St. Louis. I mean, after all, Laclede putting all of this in the hands Of a 14-year-old? Well, maybe. Historians say back then 14-year-olds often had a lot more responsibility than they do today, and Chouteau was already a clerk in the business. And as for supervising a work crew of 30 men, well, consider this. Chouteau says Laclede was giving him 2 trustworthy men who will be of great help. So maybe when it came to his authority, Chouteau had plenty of backup. There are other parts of the journal that raise questions and eyebrows. Chouteau says, for example, that after notching the tree, they returned to Fort de Chartres, where he said Laclede was telling people
that he had found a site where he was going to establish a settlement that might eventually become one of the finest cities in America.
No, no, I'm sorry.
My assumption would be that Laclede probably was much more practical at that time.
He needed to figure out how to start making a profit.
It could be that it was Chouteau's fancy rather than Laclede's, and it could have been pure civic boosterism. We don't know.
Maybe Laclede really did envision a great city, or maybe that's the way Chouteau wanted us to remember him. But perhaps the most debated part of the journal has been this little number, the date when Chouteau said he returned to begin building St. Louis. Looks like a 14, and many have celebrated the city's founding on February 14th. But if you look at the page numbers, 4 and 5, now it looks like Chouteau said he came on the 15th. Historians and historical groups have disagreed about the day, but oddly, not about the month, even though Chouteau first wrote February and then it was changed to March. But everybody still seems to think he was right the first time. But frankly, give or take a day or even a month, it doesn't really make much difference. Historians have more intriguing questions, like who were those other guys? Can we really say Laclede discovered this site, or did somebody bring him here?
The area was so well known. Folks were going up the Missouri River for trading for decades. And so the question is, who helped them? And he does not give us any indication of who those people were.
Historians Sharon Person and Carl Eckberg have put forward the name of Jean Soleil dit Lajoie as a man who would have known this bluff in the Indian mounds that used to be just north of downtown. They studied maps dated 1767 in the Spanish National Library, and there's Lajoie's name on a creek and a prairie. He was not a particularly prominent citizen of early St. Louis, but it wasn't uncommon to name geographical features after the first person who lived there. Maybe, and there are a lot of maybes in this story, it was Lajoie who sent or brought Laclede to a spot where he himself had already lived.
The speculation is that perhaps he had been on the west side of the river. He had a hunting camp. All of this is possible. But again, it's speculation that this map really encourages us to engage in.
Another St. Louis historian dismisses the Lajoie story as insignificant and backed by little evidence. And even if Lajoie had lived here first, he didn't start St. Louis. But this kind of debate is really a sign of the heightened interest in this colonial period. And it's not just because of the 250th anniversary, and it's not just local.
Now there's people all over the country that are writing about the period. It's a rich field of inquiry, and there's a lot of really excited scholars and historians that are going at it with a will right now. And I hope that this continues because, you know, this is the type of thing, this is the type of debate that really leads to greater insight of the past.
Writing along to offer some of my perspectives on the history of St. Louis and the riverfront.
One reason this period is so compelling is that it is not the story Americans are used to hearing about settlers and Indians. Being successful in the fur trade meant being successful in dealing with the local tribes, creating and managing a peaceful and profitable coexistence.
And the Native people are the ones who did the hunting. They're the ones who did the processing, initial processing of the furs and the pelts. And it was a trading partnership, a trading relationship with them. I think that for the most part, the people who lived here in early St. Louis really looked at these people as being sovereign nations and nations of equal importance.
Still, maintaining this kind of partnership was tricky. One of the journal's most colorful stories was dramatized in the 1914 pageant in Forest Park, celebrating the city's 150th anniversary.
This is amazing, this story.
Chouteau said that after he began building the settlement, about 150 warriors of the Missouri tribe showed up with their families, a whole village.
While we numbered only 30 to 35 men. But still, I should say that this tribe did not appear to have anything hostile in mind. They said they were like ducks and geese who sought clear water in order to rest and easily make a living.
And they will build their village around the house of Laclede.
These were not the new settlers Laclede needed, and they were driving away the ones he did.
The French who came over across the river and settled in early St. Louis, when the Missouris came and threatened to stay here, they fled back across the river.
Chouteau was in over his head, and he sent word from Laclede, who immediately came up from Fort de Chartres.
Monsieur de Laclede arriva.
Laclede convinced them that this new town was not clear water, but a place where they would be open to attacks from their enemies, eagles and birds of prey, he called them. At one point, Laclede tells the women to hug their children.
Until that fatal moment which will separate you from them. And that moment is not far distant if your men persist in wanting to settle here.
2 weeks after they came, the Indians moved on.
There was mutual accommodation, but there was always some trepidation, concern, and fear also as well. So there are certainly aspects of the relations in the middle Mississippi that seem more modern in the sense of mutual respect and tolerance, but there was also deeply encultured concern and fear as well.
With the Missouris gone, French settlers came from the east side, with Chouteau assigning them plots of land according to Laclede's plans. Pierre Laclede had chosen a good spot for his trading post, near the confluence, easy access to the river, safe from flooding. Chouteau says Laclede chose to honor his king, Louis XV, by naming the town for his patron saint. But St. Louis wasn't a new name in these parts. The Mississippi River was also called the St. Louis River. It's just that the name didn't stick. And in the first years of Laclede's new town, which early on had to bring in food from places like St. Genevieve, this was also known by another name, Pon Coeur, translated, short of bread.
The French nicknamed everything, and most of them were ironic nicknames, I feel. You know, they weren't always truth-telling nicknames. You call one community La Misère, misery, and another community is empty pockets, and St. Louis is short of bread.
But St. Louis was primarily about furs, not food. And it's important to note that Laclede came here with no priests, no missionaries, no soldiers. And while this was technically Spanish territory and Laclede would lose his monopoly, it would take a while for the Spanish to show up. And that gave St. Louis and Laclede a head start.
One unique aspect is the fact it was, for a while, a city without a country, a city without a sovereign. No state authority, no religious authority. And so there was a little seam of time where it was almost like a utopia for an ambitious trader.
Et cela pour faire connaître quelles étaient les raisons pourquoi les sauvages avaient...
There are really three main characters in the journal, Laclede and Chouteau, and a man whose name is less well known to us today.
Pour Monsieur de Saint-Ange de Bellerive.
Louis Saint-Ange de Bellerive had been the last French commander at Fort de Chartres. He turned it over to the British. He then came with other officials and some soldiers to St. Louis. His arrival was reenacted in the 1914 pageant because while Laclede and Chouteau started a trading post and laid out the streets, in many ways Saint-Ange de Bellerive made St. Louis a functioning town and the new regional capital.
Saint-Ange de Bellerive is the civic authority
who really helped to establish the culture that had been east of the Mississippi River and transplanted it to St. Louis.
What the journal doesn't give us is much of a picture of that culture, the daily life, the fabric of early St. Louis.
History tends to favor, of course, the wealthy and the powerful, and it'd be great to be able to know more about how the average person lived in St. Louis.
St. Louis's original street plan was revealed when the riverfront was cleared for today's Arch grounds, and this was not the site of a Puritan New England village. There were French and other Europeans, free and enslaved blacks and Indians, women who owned property, adults, children, and marriages of mixed race and heritage.
It was, really qualified for that old saw of melting pot.
If the 1914 pageant were staged today, there'd almost certainly be more diversity in the scenes calling for crowds of townspeople.
This story is becoming extremely attractive to current historians and to American values, this idea of a mutual respect, multicultural, mutually beneficial economic linkages between and among people. This may be too played up how utopian, wonderful St. Louis was.
History, after all, is supposed to be about what really happened, the way things really were, not the way we wished they were. And that's what brings us to Calvary Cemetery and the grave of Auguste Chouteau. Because this is a good example of how, when it comes to St. Louis history, you really can't believe everything you read. Many years ago, a Chouteau descendant said he would refurbish the weathered tombstone. In the process, he moved back Auguste's birthday 10 years to 1740. That means in 1764, he wasn't a 14-year-old assistant, but a 24-year-old man and a full-fledged founder of St. Louis. Laclede wasn't exactly written out of St. Louis history, but there would be efforts to write him out of Chouteau family history. You see, Auguste's father, René Chouteau, had abandoned him and his mother in New Orleans. Marie-Therese Chouteau then, let's say, took up with Pierre Laclede. They had 4 more children out of wedlock, so they all took the Chouteau name. Over time, the many descendants would not be one big, happy founding family.
Oh, no.
Ted Atwood is one of the many St. Louisans with a Chouteau in the family tree.
It was a major schism in the Chouteau family as a result of the claims of legitimacy and illegitimacy. It was a major issue.
Soon after the Americans arrived, and certainly by the mid-19th century, many St. Louisans felt that what had happened in colonial times should stay in colonial times.
A lot of people not only changed their ways, but tried to change their own family histories.
Alexander de Menil, whose mother was a Chouteau, was one who did just that. In 1921, when he was living in what is today the historic Châtillon de Menil house, he set out to remove what he called a damning stain on the family and on the purity of Madame Chouteau. De Menil was a descendant of her second son, Pierre.
It was important to him and important to that side of the family, and part of the illegitimate, quote-unquote, side of the family.
De Menil wrote a letter to the editor of the Globe Democrat in which he said his research proved that all 5 Chouteau children were legitimate, and claims otherwise were libelous statements against a true, honest, and respectable wife and mother. He reprinted this as a booklet called Madame Chouteau Vindicated. But historians weren't convinced by the revisions that were printed or even those that were carved in stone. But no one challenges Madame Chouteau's importance in early St. Louis. This is the 1914 pageant portrayal of her arriving with her 4 youngest children. She may not have been a saint, but she was a strong, resourceful, and tough woman who rose from hardscrabble beginnings to become known as the Mother of St. Louis.
It's a much better story, it's a true story of success.
If we better understood the relation between Madame Chouteau and Laclede, the 4 children that fathered by Laclede, we would better understand Laclede as a founder, as a person.
Pierre Laclede died in 1778, coming back from New Orleans. He was buried somewhere near the mouth of the Arkansas River. By then, he was deeply in debt. But Auguste, who had started out as the company clerk, had become an even better businessman than his mentor and stepfather, and was able to put things back in order. Auguste Chouteau and his brother Pierre were the real St. Louis success stories. Traders, landowners, bankers, investors, and when the Americans showed up, they were ready to do business and would become one of the most important families in the history of the American West.
Very adaptable, very quick on their feet, and very wily at trying to preserve the empire that they'd built up here.
Many believe Auguste Chouteau sat down to write his journal right around the time the Americans were taking over, when Lewis and Clark set out on their epic journey, the start of a new era for St. Louis.
So I do think it was a time when it made a lot of sense to look back. And when you read the journal or the narrative closely, it seems to be a didactic document. It's meant to teach. Its fundamental purpose isn't really to fix the date of the commencement of St. Louis, but rather I think Chouteau was trying to demonstrate or show how men in the founding time of St. Louis operated with courage, integrity, honor.
Whether we can consider it all at face value or think that some of it is self-aggrandizing for the author or his family, in some respects really doesn't matter. It's our only account, and it's one of the few accounts worldwide that tells how a city was founded.
Remember this place, Auguste. In the spring, when the ice breaks from the river, you will return to this place. And you will be
All histories of St. Louis started from these 7 leaves. You can see that this is the beginning of something big.
I again take up my journal.
The final paragraph of the journal is the opening of a new chapter, but it was never written, or it didn't survive, or maybe it just hasn't been found.
This program is made possible by support from the St. Louis Mercantile Library at the University of Missouri St. Louis and from viewers like you.